Hello, this is Nighthawk. Guys, History Hack has made it to Friday. Alina and I are basically wrecks. Alina, are you still awake?
Yeah, I think so. My voice is going though, so please bear with me, everyone.
We're completely overwhelmed because we're just about to take this session with our guest, and we've just had the most adorable logo pop through that someone's designed. It's like a cartoon of us. We will post it. You will have seen it by the time this podcast goes out. But Steve Smith, thank you so much. What a lovely thought, and we both love it. Thank you.
I'm so overwhelmed. I don't know exactly what to say. So thank you so much.
You're such a sweetheart. We will buy you a drink at some point when we're allowed out of our houses again. Um, Yeah, as I said, we are a bit wrecked. We've got to the end of the first week. We're completely overwhelmed still by the response to this podcast, and the stats. We just neither of us can believe how many of you are tuning in and downloading it. If anyone wants to give us a hand putting this thing on iTunes or YouTube or anything, we basically have no more to give. We have a YouTube channel. I have not the time or the inclination or patience to try and figure out how it works. If anyone wants to get involved, do let us know. And thank you too to Paul Carter, who looked into the whole Spotify thing for us, has basically set me straight on how that's going to work. But anyway, let me introduce our guest today because he's sitting here chomping at the bit. It is the absolutely fabulous, I love him to pieces, it is Joshua Levine. I'm just going to, before I tell you who he is, I just want you all to laugh at the fact that he spent about 5 minutes combing his hair for this and getting ready before he realised it's an audio podcast. Josh, I'm so sorry.
No, it's not. It's not your fault. It's because I don't understand technology. I'm basically an OAP, but I look good. You should know that.
You do look good. You always look good, Josh. But for anyone who lives under a rock and doesn't know who Josh is a fantastic historian. You would have seen him on your television. If you've seen anything with me in it, you'll have seen him as well because we're in a lot of stuff together. To the point that my nickname for you is Whippersnapper because someone once criticised us both on an Air documentary and said we don't need these young whippersnappers telling us about history, and you were thrilled because you were like, I'm 42 and I'm a whippersnapper.
I was over 50 at the time. I was thinking, my God, how old is the person saying this?
But anyway, not only does Josh do television, Josh has written some fantastic books. He also, so he's written books on World War One, numerous books on World War Two. If you've read any of those Forgotten Voices books, back in the day, he worked on some of those before he got massively famous. He was also the historical advisor on Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk as well. So if you have not seen Josh's face and his awesome hair that he spent 5 minutes doing, then you have seen his work. Josh, how is coronavirus for you? You're locked down, aren't you? You're in self-isolation.
We're locked down. My wife and I are locked down with our 2-year-old, and so it's kind of a joyless, open-ended Christmas here. We're watching a lot of Sooty. I'm personally watching a lot of 1970s and 80s football on YouTube and DVD. With my daughter, I'm watching a lot of Sooty, my old Sooty DVDs, which she seems to love. And finding out that Sooty, I mean, it's absolutely wonderful. I mean, it's got racist moments. There are moments in it that perhaps wouldn't be so acceptable today. Like when,
have you not decided that Sweep's family is racist and that woke culture now would not be able to handle it?
Have you seen this as well? Yes. Sweep's family. So Sweep's family come on. I mean, it's just a brilliant comic scene. I mean, Sweep's family all come into the house and there's about 30 of them who are all Sweep and all make the Sweep noise, so it's chaos. But they're all dressed in, so one's dressed in a Chinese hat, so one's a little Chinese Sweep, and another one, I mean, I'm not even going to go where some of them seem to be. 2 of them, his parents, seem to be Hasidic Jews. They, you know, like my grandfather when he came over to this country. It's all very, very weird, but brilliant. And I'm having just a surreal, I say joyless, I mean, you know, we're watching the other day, we made muffins and watched Dumbo. Oh, you only do this kind of thing at Christmas. And so I was sort of reaching up to feel the paper hat on my head. It wasn't there. We're all in for coronavirus. But anyway, weird. I mean, what can I say? Weird.
I think I'm a little bit too young for this because I used to watch Rosie and Jim, but I bet Josh, you're dancing to Rosie and Jim, right?
I would be if you played it. I've never heard of Rosie and Jim, but if you played that, I would be up like a rocket.
He'd pretty much do anything for money, won't you, Josh?
Well, let's not push that. There are one or two things I probably wouldn't, but it's interesting. You see, I have no idea what Rosie and Jim is, and you must know what Sooty is, Alina, don't you?
I think I'm a bit too young, like slightly a bit too
It's
young.
a psychopath with his hand up a bear's backside who thinks the bear is talking to him. And then
That's one way of looking at it.
so he's a little yellow bear, and then Sweep is a little grey dog. And then he has a girlfriend, Sue, who was a panda, who I always found quite snooty. I don't know about you, Josh.
Oh, incredibly snooty. I mean, she's appalling. She's absolutely awful.
I frankly don't know. Looking at it now, I don't know how City puts up with her.
I mean, and he's put up with her for over 70 years. That's the amazing thing. And in all that time, he's been 5. There's so much about it that's it sort of fits in with coronavirus. It's so weird.
Just as my corona experience of the last 24 hours has been insane. So we're going to talk to you about Blitz Spirit. That's what you're here for. But I have to say that I thought that I was fully entertaining the Blitz Spirit. I had it down. I have shopped for old people. I have locked myself in. I am rationing my gin and tonic. I have fully embraced this apparent Blitz Spirit. But when I found out that McDonald's was closing, I completely lost my shit. I went and joined a massive queue to go through the drive-through. It was so bad in the end that the police had to come and shut the A217 in Sutton because there was a half mile, then a mile queue waiting to get into the McDonald's drive-through. But luckily I got in quite early, and I went and bought one of those ridiculous boxes of 20 chicken nuggets and just came home and put it in my freezer because of all the things that coronavirus has done to me, the thought that I cannot drive 300 yards to McDonald's to satisfy my need for chicken nuggets 24 hours a day, that's what made me finally lose it.
Brilliant. So that's everyone finds their breaking point. Yours is McDonald's, don't you? And not only that, you are hoarding.
I hoarded
chicken nuggets.
They're first world problems, guys. First world problems.
Absolutely. I wouldn't claim anything else.
Let's leave corona. Well, we are actually, a lot of what we are talking about today has to do with coronavirus because of the subject matter, but let's leave our own first world problems behind and leave Sooty behind because frankly he's quite disturbing in retrospect, and get onto the history with you, Josh. So Blitz Spirit. Now you did this fantastic book, The Secret History of the Blitz, and what you did was examine all the dark side of the Blitz, if you like. You looked into people's behaviour, and so now this book is so relevant because you don't think that this Blitz spirit that we're hearing about now in the UK that people want you to embrace, you don't think it necessarily exists in kind of the halcyon way that the press are touting it as an example for us to live up to here in Britain.
No, and I think it's not surprising. The press wants to turn everything, black or white, and they want to make everything very, very simplistic. Of course they do. That's their job. And of course it wasn't at all like that. There was a lot of very, very good behaviour, and there was a lot of very, very bad behaviour, and some of that good behaviour, bad behaviour came from exactly the same people, and sometimes on the same day. Because the essential point, I think, about the Blitz was this was a time of incredible intensity, incredible stress, where the temperature of the country was really turned up. And so people went off in directions they never had before. They found things in common with each other, the most obvious being they were under bombs, and they suddenly were at risk. They shared risks they never had before, but they shared all sorts of other things as well. They shared the food they were eating, they shared the clothes they were wearing, they were sometimes sheltering together, fire watching together. You had evacuation, different classes brought together, all these things. So people suddenly shared things in common they never had before. So clearly they were in some ways brought together. But at the same time, the intensity, the danger, the sheer temperature also meant people did things, took risks that they'd never taken before. And these could be all kinds of things, tiny little things. They could be sexual, they could be in terms of crime, and they could just be in terms of suddenly, you go about your daily routine and you're shifted onto another axis. So you'll suddenly do something you would never have dreamed of doing before. And that becomes the new normal. So absolutely, it's much more complicated, interesting and nuanced than perhaps people sometimes give it credit for.
Well, at the moment, we're getting a lot of incredibly ridiculous information because back then there wasn't any social media or 24-hour news. So was it even worse? Everything must have been completely done by word of mouth.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, the newspapers existed, so people were reading stuff in either the broadsheets or the tabloids. There were magazines, but I think a lot of what was coming, the equivalent of the internet, was absolutely word of mouth, and rumors. I mean, my God, the rumor mills that were going round, and people were making their decisions on the basis of what a neighbor told them. So yeah, there wasn't but I mean, isn't that the same today? Isn't the internet just a sort of huge rumor mill? But I think there was a problem with information during the Blitz. I mean, I think people weren't necessarily getting the advice, the information that they wanted officially from the government a lot of the time. And of course, that's pretty much like today. You hear lots of people complaining that in the last few days, where I'm talking now, the last few days, the government has come out with a lot of information, but then we want to hear clarification. And if I'm self-employed, what's the situation? Or if I'm a builder, what's the situation? It's kind of the same thing. Information, when the government is making it up, as it was during the Blitz, and it kind of is now, that information comes through in dribs and drabs.
Let's talk about the fact that one thing the government in Britain have done is flung themselves into action to make this as economically undamaging as possible. And there's all these unprecedented measures, like paying people 80% of their wages and so on. And I highly suspect that this did not happen during the Blitz. And so did it happen? I'm sure you're going to say no.
Well, actually, it sort of kind of did. I mean, the authorities, did sort of go to some great lengths eventually to treat the people well. I mean, I think the government was quite taken by surprise during the Blitz by the amount of homelessness. So they were expecting, before the war, there was this idea, that the bomber will always get through. There's going to be, mass cataclysmic event where, when the bombing starts, society basically will finish, because nothing can stop the bombers getting through. That was a pre-war idea, and that bled over into the beginning of the war. So what the authorities were waiting for really was a hell of a lot of death. But what they weren't prepared for was the amount of homelessness that in London they were left with at the beginning of the Blitz, the number of damaged houses, and people who were left basically with nowhere to go. They were left with no money, only the clothes they were wearing, and their homes were open, their belongings were out in the street, and what could they do? They could go to rest centers, but rest centers, you were only meant to stay one night in a rest center before moving on. So you had this large mass of refugees who had nowhere to go. The government had to make it up on the spot, and they basically did a fabulous job very, very quickly. So in London, for example, there was talked about as the crisis in London. And they appointed this man called Henry Willink, who was an MP, later became the health minister. And he was a conservative, which shows how pragmatic the whole time was. There was no party politics. It was all a matter of, getting things sorted, getting things done. And he brought in new housing. He swept away the poor laws. He brought in instant repairs, all kinds of welfare initiatives. A lot of this stuff, actually, this stuff that happened during the Blitz paved the way for the welfare state, for certainly for the Beveridge Report and for what happened afterwards, but not in a party political way, in an absolutely sort of pragmatic way, what was needed at the time. So when I look back at this period, I'm really impressed. It's only my view, but I'm really impressed by the fact that the government, which wasn't prepared, and fair enough, it wasn't prepared. I mean, nobody really knew what was coming. Really, pulled itself together very, very quickly and sorted out what was a massive problem. And of course, you can see parallels today. The government again is having to think on its feet. I have no idea how well it's doing. How 10 years from now, when everything is looked at as pre-corona, post-corona, then we'll have all sorts of people able to tell us how well the government did. But it's certainly having to think on its feet now in a very similar way to the way the government did in 1940-41.
Talk to me. Or tell our listeners, because I already know the answer, which is why I'm feeding you this. I really want you to give everybody the example, because one of the big iconic things of the Blitz is the pictures of everybody sheltering in the underground. But that is a brilliant example of something that evolved, and actually evolved without the government, but of people feeling their way along and finding solutions. And you would assume that the government let the people down there, but that's not the case, is it?
Well, but see, this is a good example. This actually undercuts what I've just said, because, well, so basically the government, before the bombing started and before the war, wanted people to shelter in what was known as dispersal. In other words, they didn't want everyone together. The idea was that if people sheltered in, large, huge underground shelters, there were a couple of things they were worried about. First of all, they were genuinely worried that one bomb, which entered a large shelter would kill hundreds, thousands of people in one go. They're also worried about the amount of money, frankly, it would cost to build these huge shelters and the time it would take. But another thing they were worried about, which is a bit more sinister, they were worried that if lots and lots of people went underground and started to shelter underground, they basically wouldn't want to come up again. They basically become sort of counterculture, antisocial troglodytes, sort of moles. Their eyes would heal up, and they'd never become productive members of society again. You get a sort of counterculture living underground. That's genuinely what they thought. And to be, it's interesting also, Henry Moore, the sculptor, I mean, he went down into the underground and started to take sketches of people down there, because he found, he was looking for something really basic, people in really sort of basic primordial situation. And that's what he found down there. So, he found a kind of strange troglodyte counterculture down there once the sheltering did begin in the underground. But anyway, the people, they basically brought about tube sheltering themselves. The tubes had been used in the First World War, but the authorities decided, no, we're not going to have sheltering in the tubes. We want the tubes to stay running all the time. We want the tubes to be available for taking important documents around the city. So no, we don't want people sheltering down there. Well, the people took it into their own hands. You had, for example, shelterers from Stepney, led by Phil Paratin, who was a communist MP, leading a bunch of people into the Savoy shelter and ordering cups of tea, being very ordered. It was really a public relations exercise, but saying, why shouldn't ordinary people get good shelters? And then in the tubes, you had people forcing their way down. You had this happening, I think, at Liverpool Street and at Holborn. And if you look at the government record, you can see that the head of the Metropolitan Police, Games, he's actually asked, he said, what do you want me to do about this? Do you want us to shoot? Do you want to get the army in and shooting at our own people? Obviously, the answer to that was no. So it became a kind of fait accompli. The people insisted on sheltering down there, and the government were not about to stand in their way. So I suppose I'd temper what I said before. Yes, the government generally did the right thing, and sometimes their hand was forced by the people. Another example is trekking. A lot of people in provincial towns, once the Blitz had widened after November 1940 to places outside of London, so places like Coventry, Southampton, Liverpool, wherever, all over the country. What a lot of people started doing was, instead of staying at home because there wasn't any deep sheltering, they would basically move outside of the city, and they'd sleep in the countryside, and they'd sleep under hedges, but then come back in to the city next day and work in the factories or do whatever they were doing. So it was kind of I don't know what you would call it. It was like a sort of extreme commuting.
It's astonishing, don't you? Because did not people do this last weekend? They got in camper vans, didn't they, and went to the Highlands to spend the weekend out there for safety. And
There's nothing new.
And what you're
Exactly.
saying as well about the government essentially doing the right thing, but in some ways having their hands forced by the people, is exactly what we've seen with the lockdown. In my interpretation is our government gave us the opportunity to be sensible and do as we were told, and people didn't do it, so now we're under lockdown. And what you're saying, nothing new. But this iconic Blitz Spirit, one thing that people here in the UK clearly seem to think was better and that we should be living up to is general behaviour. Do you see any parallels with people's behaviour in terms of refusing to do as the government says, and stockpiling?
Many. I mean, again, people are people. In the beginning of the war, if the war began and people started hoarding food. I mean, it just quite simply did. Rationing didn't come in immediately, didn't come in early, but only at the beginning of 1940, and people were hoarding. If you look at behavior in the shelters early on, in September, October 1940, in the tubes, behavior was pretty bad. I mean, the mass observation, which the organization sent observers to watch what was going on and report on it. If you look at their report for October 1940, they're down, they have an observer down in a tube who sees people fighting to get in, there's jostling, there's arguing once they're down there, there's a small boy being thrown out who's trying to reserve seats for his parents. And then they watch as the war goes on and they notice that the behavior gets better. So people find their routine. I mean, one thing that you notice happening in shelters, you've got the behavior getting better, but one reason for this is that quite organically, the more dominant personalities start taking over and start telling people what to do. The majority of people are happy to be told what to do. And once that happens and each particular shelter gets its sort of natural leader, then the order just starts to sort itself out. And that happened, relatively quickly. But there were other bad behaviors in shelters. I mean, one thing, I don't know if you're aware of this, this was a thing called droppers. So basically criminal gangs would put members into the queues for shelters, early on in the day. They'd get down there, they'd take the best place, and other people who actually wanted to use the shelter would come down, and the dropper would then basically sell that place to genuine shelterers. And they would charge more. It's like ticket touts, really. I mean, they would charge more for places in the deeper, safer shelters, less for a less safe shelter. And another thing you find if you start reading around the Blitz, lots of showing off, people ignoring the sirens, people wanting to show that they're not afraid, people wanting to show, I think the basis of this really is fear. People wanting to demonstrate, people who are afraid, wanting to demonstrate they're not at all afraid by, the siren goes off and people very, very blasé, is that the siren? I barely recognize it. And so you have that kind of sort of deliberate ignoring, flouting of that kind of rule. And one thing that I find fascinating about shelters, I have to say, is this story. Guy Gibson was the leader of the Dams raid, Operation Chastise. But at this point, during the Blitz, he was a night fighter. He was with 29 Squadron. And in November 1940, Guy Gibson, who basically spends most of his nights up in the air, fruitlessly trying to shoot down German bombers, pretty difficult and dangerous job. He's in London one night, and he goes down into a shelter. Bear in mind, November 40, and he's down there. And because he's wearing his RAF uniform, people start looking at him, and then a kind of mob develops, and they start shouting at him. And they start saying to him, "Why aren't you up there? Why aren't you attacking the bastards? Why?" And he said he got so nervous, the leader of the Dams raid, got so nervous that he left the shelter and went back. He said, "I'd rather take my chances up there with the bombs." So two things here. First of all, he's actually risking his life on a nightly basis, and he's fighting those bastards. But secondly, we're talking November. We're talking weeks after the end of the Battle of Britain, when the RAF were total heroes. So there's so many. This is how the mood changes during wartime. But also, this is the sort of variable behaviour that isn't necessarily part of the consensus. Our idea of the Blitz. It's more interesting, it's more nuanced, and it's why it's worth looking closely at.
Josh, just quickly,
Yeah.
restore my faith in humanity.
Yes.
Give me one beautiful example of something that represents this Blitz Spirit folklore.
Oh, okay. I can give you what I think is a sort of defining, because I think Blitz Spirit was real, by the way. Having said all of what I've just said, it actually coexists alongside the bad behavior. And, I think it's sometimes very, very easy to just dismiss it. Even the book, the fantastic book by called The Myth of the Blitz, he's not claiming that Blitz Spirit didn't exist. He's just saying it's more complicated, more nuanced. And so my defining story, and this was told to me by a fantastic woman called Joan Varley. She was well into her 90s when she told me this. She was a young girl, and she was on a bus traveling in London, traveling through Westminster. She was smoking on the top at the back. You could do that in those days. And it was just her at the back, and then there was just one other man right at the front. And as they were driving along, they heard a bomb coming down. And the driver heard it as well, so he veered off the route. And then when it exploded elsewhere, he got back onto the route. But while the bomb was coming down, the man at the front got up and he just walked slowly down to the back, and he sat next to Joan and he held her hand, total stranger. And then when the bus was back on its route, he didn't look at her. He just dropped her hand, got up and walked back to the front and never turned back. That's instinctive Blitz Spirit. That is the idea of people coming together in danger. So to say that it didn't exist is just too simplistic. Of course it existed. That's your essence. And then multiply it in different ways. And that's what Blitz Spirit was.
It's the difference, isn't it, that we can't reach out to each other now. I mean, if he tried to hold her hand now, you'd be like, get away from me, you're contaminated.
If you try to hold her hand now, you get a £30 fine. I mean, but that is the difference. That's absolutely, there are some similarities, absolutely plenty of similarities actually between now and then, plenty of things we can draw out. But of course the big difference is that, the kind of danger, the bombs were coming from the sky, causing instant death, terrible wounds, homelessness. And, the danger now is a virus spread by contact. So yeah, I mean, couldn't be more different.
Let's just talk about another similarity. They called for 250,000 NHS volunteers. I signed up last night. You can be driving medication around, people around if they have hospital appointments. You can be delivering shopping. It's even checking in on lonely people as well, and making sure they're not completely alone and lonely and becoming depressed. They got 170,000 straight off, and I just read just before we started taping, and you did too, they've now hit 400,000 people willing to go and do this, which is just exceptional. But I mean, I know you're going to say yes, this spirit of volunteerism must have been alive and well during the Blitz.
Absolutely it was. They even called it volunteerism, and it's absolutely heartwarming when you look at the way people did rally. So you've got the ARP, air raid precautions, and in some of these, people always think of the wardens, but all sorts of people were ARP, stretcher parties, mortuary vans, all sorts of different roles, difficult roles, fire watchers. And then you had other voluntary services, the YMCA, Citizens Advice Bureau. The one that I always like is the WVS, the Women's Voluntary Service, because my God, the different things that they did, the staffing the rest centers, caring for the homeless, the mobile canteens, they were running those. They were driving ambulances. What was the one thing? They were collecting rose hips from the countryside because they contained a lot of vitamin C. I mean, whatever it was, these women were doing it.
Oh, well, Queen Mary was driving around Badminton, wasn't she, after she got, against her will, sent out there for her own safety, was driving around like a lunatic, rallying everybody. I can't remember. I think it's glass or recyclable metal or something. So everybody was at it.
Well, railings, I mean, another big thing that the WVS were very keen on, that, they were removing railings and there was so much volunteerism that a lot of people were just being turned down. They couldn't even get accepted to do it. And I'm always fascinated by the psychology behind these things. Why so many people are keen to do it. And, there are some, there's certainly peer pressure, and there's people feeling guilty that their own situation is safe. but then there's just a lot of good feeling. I mean, you can absolutely see it. And, enormous numbers of people volunteering then. And as you say, we seem to have close on 500,000 people willing to volunteer now in 2020, which is just wonderful.
Tell me a story, Josh, about the crime and the Blitz and the people taking advantage. I think we should do looting. Let's do the looting.
There was a load of looting. Of course, there was lots of looting. The opportunity was there. Houses were opened up, and it took a hell of a lot of self-control to walk past a house where there was nobody around, and not maybe to take something, that you could use. And in fact, people were being told to make do with what they have and to recycle. So, who's to say that taking something that from a house where people had been killed wasn't just recycling. And I read this terrible story of the head of a heavy rescue squad who took half a bottle of gin that was on this site from the house and just handed it round to his men who were having a terrible time, and was actually convicted of theft for doing that. So, it was a grey area, looting, but it was also in some cases very extreme. And certainly one extreme example that I can think of is a nightclub in London called the Café de Paris, and this was a very, very famous, well-frequented nightclub, which was considered completely safe because it was underground, and completely underground. And anyway, a bomb managed to basically get through an underground, exploded on the dance floor in the Café de Paris in 1941, and the scene was absolute carnage. Although a lot of people, interestingly or weirdly, were absolutely looked unharmed, but were killed by the blast. And these were the people who were particularly preyed on, because even before any of the emergency services had been on the scene, the looters had been down there. I mean, some people talked about the looters as being a kind of extra emergency service because they were so quick on the scene of a disaster. So they got down, and when the police got down, one of the first policemen down there was a man called Ballard Berkeley, who he was a special constable. But you'll probably have seen him on television because he played the Major in Fawlty Towers.
Oh, no way.
Yeah. He's. I mean, I love him in Fawlty Towers. It paints him in a different light when you think of him as one of the first down here in the Café de Paris. And he said he was shocked because, looking around, he could see that the looters had been down and they cut the fingers off of people, off of women to get to their rings, and basically taking the fingers off. And he was utterly shocked to see this kind of thing, and it is utterly shocking to hear it even now.
You just don't associate that kind of behaviour with the Blitz, do you? Because of this kind of folklore that we have about how...
You don't. But people are people. There are people who would do that now. There were people who would do that then. And there were people who would do that, 50, 100, 1,000 years ago. There are people who behave that way. And it's as simple as that. So no, we don't associate it with the Blitz, but there it is. It was there.
I remember vaguely there was a story about people looting or people trying to steal during the Blitz, but it ended up with an amazingly happy ending that they couldn't take any credit for, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's one story that I found which I think absolutely gives you a sense of how good bad behavior coexisted, how the temperature of the time really got people behaving in extreme ways. So basically, there was this criminal gang. And what they did was to go out and steal safes during bombing raids, because they were working on the basis that not many people would be around during the bombing raids. If they actually wore ARP uniforms, so much the better. People wouldn't question them. So what they would do, they would steal a van. They would take that van to a site of somewhere they knew there was a safe. They would take the safe into the van, take it away, and then in their own time open up that safe. So this is what they did. They went along on this one particular night to London Bridge. They parked up. They went into this warehouse, and inside the warehouse, they started to manhandle this safe out. Well, they got into the doorway. A bomb exploded nearby, threw them all up into the air. There were 4 of them. Threw the safe up into the air. They decided tonight, let's just get away. We're safe, but let's go. So out they go. One of them, who goes by the name of Spider, which I suspect is not his real name, looked up and saw in a third floor window a little girl, and she was in a building, and the building was on fire. Now, Spider was a cat burglar, so if there's anything Spider can do, it's shimmy up drain pipes, and that's what he started to do. Went up, and he got the girl in his arms, and he was wondering how to bring her down, because that was going to be more difficult. When at that point, along came a fire engine, and there was a policeman there as well. The fire engine basically got Spider and the girl down to the ground, and the policeman was so impressed by what he'd done that he wanted to get his name and address, wanted to recommend it for some kind of reward. The safe was still sitting over there in the background. Nobody had spotted it. The others had all scarpered. Spider just wanted to, last thing he wanted to do was leave his details for the police. So he just said, no, they're great, and off he went. But what that story does, I think, is to show that temperature of the period, that intensity, the fact that in kind of the flash of a bomb, you could go from stealing a safe to saving a life. And that's what this period was all about. It's the intensity that drove people to extremes. That, in a way, is a sort of defining story of the period.
It's just mad. If you were going to loot, you two, where would you loot? I reckon I'd make a killing. I'd empty Pandora completely, because it's loads of little stuff and I could get it all in one bag, and then I'd run off and I'd bank it, and then I'd sell it after this is all over when people have got money again. What would you do?
How long have we got?
Not that long. Just pick one.
I have 4, so I'll rattle off really quick. So, motorbike shops, chocolate shops, Michael Kors, clothing. I'm going to stop there.
Michael Kors can... Oh, they stole my money. I don't want anything from them. I'd just set fire to Michael Kors. Go on, Josh.
But Michael Kors, it's not even that good stuff, is it? It's sort of, it's got a name to it, but it's not even that nice, is it? Or
exactly, Josh, because I got bought a £350 smartwatch from them that never ever worked, that they kept for 9 months to repair, promised they'd refund the money, didn't refund the money, and then just sent the watch back, which I no longer want, because in the meantime, Christmas happened and I asked for a Fitbit. So do you know what? I would loot them. I'd loot £350 worth of Michael Kors merchandise. And Alina, you can have it.
Yes.
I don't know what I'd really, I go through phases of things. See, at the moment, I'm really into the garden. So, but what's the point of looting a garden centre? I mean, it's just insane.
That makes you sound so old.
I am. I don't know.
Can you not, even if you're having a midlife crisis, instead of a garden centre, can you not like an Aston Martin showroom or something?
Yeah, an Aston Martin show. No, actually, I'm sticking with the garden centre. I'm going to go around at my leisure during the Blitz, helping myself to hostas and
petunias.
Yes, absolutely. Passion. I need a passion flower creeper at the moment, so that's what I'm going for.
I'm leaving this behind because, frankly, Josh, I'm disappointed in you. So I'm going to put you back on history.
I know it's because it's in my mind at the time, and this is what I'm like. Anyway, but yes.
Anyway, right. I want to know: did people? Because a lot of people are behaving, I think, during this Corona crap in a way that they don't normally behave. Did people become criminals overnight during the Blitz? And did people try and exploit it? Like, I'm wondering, people saying like now, will they try and say they work more hours than they did to get money out of the government on the wages thing? Is that possible? Did this happen?
Did it ever happen? This absolutely. I mean, this in a way. This is when you people talk about crime in the Blitz, and they think about the big, set piece crimes. And actually, this is where first of all, a lot of people just inadvertently became criminals overnight because of all the wartime regulations that were coming in, and people had absolutely no idea what these were. And they were strict liability, so whatever they did, they became a criminal. So, and you think of turning on lights and turn that light out and all that kind of thing, and food, but there were so there's one example I found of a vicar who rang his church bells, and ringing church bells had been banned because they were meant to be an indicator of the coming of the invasion or parachute troops. And he rang his church bells, and he ended up being sent to prison for 12 days. which, and he said, I didn't know anything about this. Whether he did or not, never mind, strict liability, prison for 12 days. There was another crime that I found, which was making a statement likely to cause alarm or despondency, which basically means bringing down,
the whole of
something.
Twitter would be banged up, wouldn't it?
Well, do you remember a few years ago, there was the Twitter joke trial, the guy who made that joke about bombing Nottingham Airport, and he ended up, it's very similar to that. He ended up in court. I can't remember what happened with him, but he ended up in court for making a joke on Twitter about bombing an airport.
Well, right now we've got Prince Philip. If I hear every day, I hear from someone new that there's a new rumor that Prince Philip has died.
Well, I mean, absolutely. I mean, my God, the rumor, and we see people trending on Twitter. I mean, that's your immediate thought is they're dead, and sometimes it actually says they're dead and they're not dead. This guy, a guy called Cecil Hughes, who I find was living in Oxford, and he basically he went to fix somebody's electricity meter, and while he was there, he basically made some bad jokes, which, let's face it, we've all done. And very often sometimes, and he made some bad jokes and sort of in slightly bad taste, not really, but about what would, if the Germans came now, they'll make Ribbentrop king, rubbish like that. And the woman whose meter he was doing basically complained that this was not the sort of thing a loyal subject should be saying. And he was found guilty and he was fined for causing alarm or despondency. So that was then there were people who actually did, take the system and try and sort of twist it to their advantage. So there was a government compensation scheme for if you had a bombed out house, you were entitled to, I think it was £500. I forget exactly how much. So this one man, Walter Handy, applied, put in 19 separate applications, and for his pain was sent to prison for I forget how long. So there were people who absolutely, some of them who just inadvertently, Noel Coward got in trouble for financial reasons. Ivan Novello, who's like the big songwriter, the big musical hero, had been for years at this point. He was sent to prison for petrol offences during the war, and so there were a lot of people who either fell foul of the rules without realizing they'd done anything. It became illegal, really weird things.
My grandfather went to jail. It broke him.
What
Because my great aunt, who has since sadly passed away, her first husband was an absolute ratbag, wife beater, just scum, absolute scum. He had kicked her down the stairs and she had lost her. She was 8 months pregnant and their baby girl died. He was an absolute monster. And I think whatever happened as a result of all this, the reaction that my great grandfather had to him, he planted a gun in the house and called the police, and he was found with a firearm on the property, and I think he did 3 months in Wandsworth prison and was never the same again. He actually died in I think 1952 or 1953. So
and when was this? When was he?
In the middle of World War II.
Really? Well, for firearms, there's another one, because guns. You got me going now. I mean, guns. Not everybody, but a lot of people had guns, and you had a lot of young men with access to guns who used them. And so we had all kinds of things. I found one in 1940, an undergraduate at Oxford who opened fire in the quad and killed, I forget how many people, certainly one or two people in the quad. We think of that as a sort of modern American, opening fire in a college, but that's happening in 1940 because guns are around. You had lots of soldiers who were coming back on leave with their weapons, finding their wives, with other people, and then, killing the other person. And it's so interesting. You see the courts bending over backwards to be lenient. They did not want to send these men to prison. There was one man who came home from leave, found his wife in bed with another man, shot the other man. He was then charged with manslaughter, came to a jury trial, found guilty, and the judge bound him over I mean, can you imagine that? Binding up someone over for shooting someone dead. That's how desperate the criminal justice system was, not to send these people to prison, not to criminalize them, not to keep them out of the army.
Didn't that happen? Quentin Crisp, wasn't he bound over? Let's talk about the increase in sexuality. You had spoken to me before about Quentin Crisp, and didn't he? That the authorities looked the other way there as well, didn't they?
They did, and that's a really interesting one, because talking about the people going to extremes and the changing social mood, homosexuality, which was obviously a crime back then, the authorities basically had better things to be focusing on. The police, who were stretched anyway, had better things to be looking out for than people committing what would then considered indecent acts. So Quentin Crisp, who was very, very flamboyant back then, had long, blonde, wavy hair. He dressed, in really sort of outrageous manner for the time. He was very used before the war to being beaten up. He was endlessly being attacked and people sort of swearing at him in the street. He noticed that at this time, once the bombing began, first of all, people were talking to him in a pleasant way. He actually said, everyone is talking to everyone else. They're even talking to me. And then even beyond that, he talks about London becoming a huge paved double bed because people were trying things. And there was a lot of, but I found one account of a man who, slept with another man in a train, in a platform during a raid. And he just says outright, I wanted to try it. Suddenly here we were, we could all die. I wanted to see what it was like. And he said it was enhanced by the fact that there were bombs exploding all around. So not only was there more sexual behavior, and this goes for straight people as well, there was a lot more sexual behavior because people were just sort of, much more living for the moment.
I don't know how much of it had to do with sexual behaviour, but my nan was engaged 3 times to American servicemen in World War II. And what she would do, it was more like a business venture though, so she would get engaged to them and they would give her a ring and then she'd dump them. So she actually ended up with a collection of engagement rings which she could pawn.
Blimey, I bet your nan was a tough woman.
Yeah, do you know what, the thing is though, like shockingly at this point, I think she's only about 16 or 17 at this point. So yeah, let's not judge her though. Like you say, wartime abandon.
No, I'm not. No, I don't. I have nothing but admiration for your nan.
In my head, this is a chaste business venture, and that's the way it's staying. Because otherwise, I may crumble.
As we're on the same topic of the nan marriage, what's this concept of a wartime marriage? I'm a little bit lost here.
Okay, so I mean, people taking it a bit further than nan. This is the idea that basically, because you had lots of men who were away in the forces, so leaving their married wives alone, and those men would effectively be replaced in the towns and cities by other people coming in. So you had loads of foreigners coming in. You had a big wave of Canadians, first of all, before the Americans came in. But you had lots of people coming in from Nazi-occupied Europe. You had lots of people coming in from the colonies and dominions, and also people coming in from around Britain. So there's this one example that I found, which stands for a lot of other examples, I think. Look at this woman who said that her mother was been in a fairly loveless marriage, and her husband had gone off to fight. And at that time, this was during the Blitz, and at that time a man had come in working for one of the ministries from Scotland, who was also married, and he'd come down to London. So he was on his own. This woman's mother was on her own. The two of them found each other, and they got together, and they became, basically, to all intents and purposes, a married couple. So they spent all their time together. They were totally loyal to each other, but always on the understanding that when the war was over, they would separate. That was it. And they'd go back to their marriages, their real marriages. And this was something that when I started to look into it, actually happened quite a lot. This idea of the wartime marriage, out of, like, so much that was happening at this time, out of pragmatism, because, people were lonely. because it was easier to get through this with somebody else, because culturally, you were meant to be with somebody else. Socially, you were meant to be with somebody else. And it sort of became, in my mind, I sort of view it as the kind of, sexual equivalent to powdered egg. It was something, for the duration, but not intended to last any longer. And I find it actually quite touching, pragmatic, but also quite touching, the way these people were loyal to each other. And I think, if you see the film Brief Encounter, there's certainly an element of that in the film, I think. And it's one of these, I just find it very moving, anyway.
Now, in the war, suddenly, the factory workers are catapulted into the limelight. And we're seeing now, with the NHS and the supermarket workers, aren't we?
I think it's very, very similar. I think that, this sudden, leap in status, leap in importance for people who, weren't really given the time of day by officials literally a month ago, are now being seen as incredibly important key workers, people that we can't continue without. And there's absolutely a parallel there with the way, at this time, so many people in Britain started being basically treated better. The authorities realized that the war could only be won by the factory workers doing their thing, by making the munitions, by keeping the country going. So wages went up, and their protections increased, and all sorts of people doing all sorts of different things that hadn't been valued suddenly were immensely valued. And you can see the same kind of thing happening now. The people who are working in shops, in supermarkets, particularly in the health service, not just the doctors, but the people doing the other roles in the health service, suddenly, they're being applauded in the streets. And one thing I think is worth thinking about is that, once the war was over, the people who had been treated better, it was very hard for the government, even though they, clearly wanted to at different times, wanted to sort of roll back the advantages, the better treatment that these people had. They wanted to go back in some ways to the position before the war. It's very difficult. Once you've made life better for people, very, very hard for a government to make it worse again. So once we have, basically improved the status of these people, improve their pay, improve the way, people across the board, actually, it's going to be very interesting to see how, when this crisis is over, God willing, it won't be too long, how the government try to sort of roll that back, or whether we're faced with a completely new situation, a completely new sort of social, economic pecking order. I don't know. It's all up for grabs.
We could go on all night, and we really could, but we're going to have to wrap this up. Do you know what? This cast has been so relevant and so interesting. I think essentially what we've been saying for far too long now is that yes, some semblance of unified spirit gripped Britain during the Blitz, and that there are lots of touching examples of it, but people aren't saints, and people just aren't that very different now. We haven't created a generation of monsters. Josh, thank you so much for coming on. I have to get you back on. I'd love to have you on to do World War I flying with me. That would be epic.
Oh, I'd love to.
No more World War I.
Shut up, nobody asked you.
Do you mind? I'd like to come back on.
Yeah.
She's just told me. She has just told me. Josh, I love you. I think you're great. But please, no more World War I. Bring on some World War II. We want World War II.
Don't make me mute you. Josh can come on and do World War II as well. He's writing actually his new book, which we haven't had time to talk about. He's currently writing a book about El Alamein. Is that right?
Well, I'm writing about North Africa, about basically the special birth of the special relation, a lot of different things. I say writing. I mean, all my sources have dried up because I can't get into an archive. But in theory, yes, that's what I'm doing.
Oh,
that
Josh,
one, please.
Josh, I love you. My whippersnapper in crime. You are awesome.
Yeah.
Alina, I'm gonna let you introduce who's on tomorrow, but only if you promise not to scream again, because she's fangirling. She's out of control on this one.
I have been going absolutely mental over our next guest, tomorrow's guest. I don't even know how to say this. Tomorrow, ladies and gentlemen, tomorrow we have Mary Beard. Mary Beard, people. Mary Beard.
We have a list of questions, don't we, as long as the Magna Carta, long as the Doomsday Book, of people.
That is not including mine. That is not including mine. So, I'm so sorry. Everybody, I really apologise, but Mary Beard, she is so awesome. So, but right, we better move on because I'm going to fangirl for about 20 minutes and we don't have time for that.
We really don't.
But Josh, I really want to say thank you so much for coming on.
Pleasure.
Okay.
Really lovely.
It was great fun. Love to have you on again. But that is it from us. So remember, people, stay safe. And if at all possible, stay in your house. This is Nighthawk signing off.